My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and I operate quietly in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate investing. I thought I had seen every kind of cutthroat tactic the business world had to offer, but nothing prepared me for the absolute cruelty of my own family. Picture pulling up to your generational home in the dead of winter to find your 9-year-old daughter locked out shivering in the freezing snow next to a massive sold sign. My mother told my little girl she was homeless and left her at the gate for 4 hours. When I saw the text from my mother confirming her betrayal, I did not scream or beg. I simply replied, "Okay." Just 3 days later, my parents received a phone call that had them screaming in absolute terror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after the people who were supposed to protect you tried to tear you down. The brutal, biting wind of a Chicago winter is something you never truly get used to, no matter how long you have lived in the city. The air feels heavy with ice and the cold seeps deep into your bones, making every breath feel like a sharp ache in your chest. I had just landed after a grueling 3-day commercial real estate conference in New York. My mind was buzzing with cap rates, zoning laws, and negotiation strategies as I navigated my luxury SUV through the darkening streets. The heated leather seats and the quiet hum of the engine were a comforting sanctuary against the harsh reality outside my tinted windows. I was exhausted, but looking forward to getting back to the South Side brownstone, where my family had lived for generations. I could not wait to see my beautiful 9-year-old daughter Zuri and wrap her in a warm hug. As I turned onto our familiar tree-lined street, the headlights of my vehicle swept across the frozen front lawn of the brownstone, illuminating something that made my blood run instantly cold. It was not the weather that chilled me, but the sight of a massive, arrogant sold sign pounded aggressively into the frozen earth. And there, plastered right in the center of that sign, was the grinning, overly confident face of my white brother-in-law, Connor. Connor was a man who fancied himself a real estate mogul because he watched a few television shows about flipping houses. But the sign was only the second thing I noticed. The first thing, the sight that literally stopped my heart, was a small figure huddled against the wrought iron front gate. It was Zuri. My sweet, innocent little girl was sitting on her small school backpack, pulling her thin jacket tightly around her trembling body. She was shivering violently, her shoulders shaking with every gust of the freezing wind. I threw the car into park and leapt out into the frigid air, leaving the engine running and the door wide open. I did not care about the snow soaking through my expensive trousers or the wind whipping my hair. I sprinted to the gate, dropping to my knees on the icy sidewalk. Zuri looked up at me, her lips blue and her cheeks stained with frozen tears. She had been crying for so long that she did not even have the energy to sob anymore. "Mommy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Grandma locked the doors. She told me to wait outside because we do not live here anymore. She said we are homeless now. A primal blinding rage ignited deep within my chest, but I forced myself to remain perfectly calm for my daughter. I could not afford to panic. I pulled off my heavy wool coat and wrapped it tightly around her small frame, lifting her into my arms. I could feel how cold her skin was, how her little heart was racing like a trapped bird. I carried her to the SUV and placed her gently into the passenger seat, turning the heat up to the maximum setting. I grabbed her small suitcase from the icy pavement, tossed it into the back, and climbed into the driver's seat. I sat there for a moment, watching Zuri slowly begin to thaw, her trembling subsiding as the warm air enveloped her. Only then did I reach into my purse and pull out my phone. The screen was lit up with a barrage of notifications, but one message stood out from the rest. It was a text from my mother, Brenda, the woman who had given birth to me, the woman who was supposed to be the matriarch and protector of our family, had sent me a cold, calculated message while I was hundreds of miles away. I opened the text and read the words that were meant to destroy my life. "Connor found a cash buyer for the house. Chloe needs the capital to fund her new lifestyle brand. I locked the doors. You and Zuri need to figure it out. You are homeless now." I sat in the warm, quiet cabin of my car and read those words 3 times. My mother Brenda had always been obsessed with appearances and social climbing within her church community. But above all else, she was obsessed with enabling my younger sister Chloe. Chloe was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She was spoiled, entitled, and completely reliant on our mother's blatant favoritism. Chloe had recently married Connor, a man whose arrogance was only matched by his profound incompetence in business. Together, they formed a trio of toxicity that I had spent my entire adult life trying to navigate. This betrayal was not a spontaneous decision. It was a calculated strike executed perfectly while I was out of town at a conference. They knew I was away. They knew Zuri would be coming home from school. They deliberately left a 9-year-old child in the freezing cold for 4 hours, just to force my hand to humiliate me, and to clear the way for Chloe to get her hands on some quick cash for a vanity project. I looked at the text again, and instead of launching into a sad monologue about my traumatic childhood, my mind instantly connected the past to the present. I muttered under my breath while rubbing Zuri's cold hands. Just like when you drained my college fund to pay for Chloe's lavish destination wedding. You really think I am still that defenseless 20-year-old girl you can walk all over? You think I am still the scapegoat who will just put her head down and take the abuse? Brenda was waiting for a reaction. I knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to call her crying hysterically, begging for a place to stay, pleading for access to the house so I could gather our winter clothes. She wanted the satisfaction of hearing the panic in my voice so she could tell me to be a strong black woman and figure it out on my own. She thrived on the power dynamic of seeing me broken. She wanted to play the victim to her church friends, claiming she had to make a tough love decision to help her youngest daughter build a business. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I refused to shed a single tear over people who viewed my daughter as acceptable collateral damage in their greedy little games. I opened the keyboard on my phone. I did not type out a paragraph of rage. I did not threaten them with legal action. I simply typed 2 letters. Okay, I hit send. No punctuation, no emotion. The absolute power of silence. Let them sit with that. Let them wonder why the daughter they just made homeless was not begging for mercy. I put my phone away and turned to Zuri, who was now holding her hands up to the heating vents. She looked at me with wide, nervous eyes. "Mommy, where are we going to sleep tonight? Are we really homeless?" I reached over and stroked her hair, offering her the most reassuring and confident smile I could muster. "Listen to me very carefully, Zuri. We are far from homeless. Your grandmother and your Aunt Chloe made a very foolish mistake today, but we are not going to let it ruin our evening. We are going to go somewhere much nicer than this old brownstone." I shifted the SUV into drive. The tires crunched satisfyingly over the packed snow as I pulled away from the curb, leaving the arrogant sold sign and the dark, silent brownstone in my rearview mirror. I did not look back. I steered the car toward the glowing skyline of downtown Chicago. The city looked beautiful at night, the towering skyscrapers cutting through the winter fog like beacons of success and power. For years, my family assumed I was just a mid-level employee at a standard appraisal firm scraping by to take care of my daughter. They saw me wearing simple professional clothes and driving a nice but unassuming car, and they projected their own financial insecurities onto me. What Brenda, Chloe, and Connor did not know, what nobody in my family knew, was that over the past decade, I had built a massive commercial real estate portfolio. I did not just appraise properties, I acquired them, rehabilitated them, and held them under various anonymous corporate entities. I operated strictly in the shadows, using layers of legal protection to shield my wealth from the exact people who had just tried to destroy me. We navigated through the bustling downtown streets, the holiday lights still sparkling on the trees lining the magnificent mile. I pulled into the private heated underground garage of a breathtaking 5-star luxury high-rise. It was a building known for housing executives, athletes, and celebrities. It was also a building where one of my shell companies happened to own the top-floor penthouse outright. I parked in my reserved spot and helped Zuri out of the car, grabbing her small suitcase. We walked into the private elevator lobby, where the concierge greeted me warmly by name. "Good evening, Miss Kendra. We have the suite prepared and the thermostat is set exactly how you like it. Thank you, Marcus, I replied, leading Zuri into the velvet-lined elevator car. I pressed the button for the top floor. Zuri was looking around in absolute wonder, her fear from the freezing brownstone gate already beginning to melt away in the face of this unbelievable luxury. The elevator doors chimed and opened directly into the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of Lake Michigan and the glittering Chicago skyline. The space was immaculate, decorated in warm tones, with plush modern furniture, a massive gourmet kitchen, and a living area that was larger than the entire first floor of Brenda's brownstone. Zuri dropped her backpack on the polished hardwood floor, her mouth hanging open. "Mommy, whose house is this?" "It is ours, baby," I told her, helping her out of her coat. "We have a few places like this, but I think this one will be perfect for us right now. Why do you not go pick out your bedroom and then we can order whatever you want from room service for dinner? You can even have ice cream and a movie in bed tonight." She squealed with delight, completely forgetting the trauma of the afternoon, and ran down the wide hallway to explore the bedrooms. I walked over to the massive windows and looked out over the city, my reflection superimposing over the grid of streets below. My family thought they had broken me. They thought they had left me with nothing, scrambling in the snow to find a warm place for my child to sleep. They thought Connor was a genius for convincing a cash buyer to take the property off their hands so Chloe could play pretend entrepreneur. I pulled my phone back out and looked at the short two-letter text I had sent my mother. It was the calm before the storm. I knew something that they were completely oblivious to. They had not just kicked a struggling single mother out into the cold. They had awakened a sleeping giant who held the financial keys to their entire existence. The trap was already set, and they had just gleefully walked right into it. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the pristine kitchen island and smiled. The next few days were going to be extremely educational for Connor, Chloe, and my mother, Brenda. I sat behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel of my SUV, listening to the heavy blast of the climate control system fighting against the Chicago freeze. Beside me, Zuri was curled into a tight ball, buried deep within the folds of my wool coat. Her teeth had finally stopped chattering, but her eyes remained fixed on the dashboard, wide and traumatized. I reached over and rubbed her shoulder, feeling the icy dampness of her clothes beneath the heavy wool. I pulled my phone from my bag. The screen illuminated the darkened cabin, casting a harsh blue glow over my face. Dozens of notifications stacked up on my lock screen. Missed calls from neighbors, an automated alert from the brownstone security system showing the access codes had been manually overridden, and a string of messages from my mother, Brenda. I tapped open the thread. The message sat there, a block of text devoid of any maternal warmth, any hint of hesitation or guilt. It read like a corporate eviction notice drafted by someone who felt utterly untouchable. "Connor found a cash buyer for the house. Chloe needs the capital to fund her new lifestyle brand. I locked the doors. You and Zuri need to figure it out. You are homeless now." I read the words again, and then a third time. I let the sheer audacity of the betrayal wash over me. It was not just the fact that they had sold the house right out from under me. It was the absolute calculated cruelty of the execution. They knew my schedule. Brenda had called me 3 days ago, asking casually when my real estate conference in New York wrapped up. I had told her my flight landed at 6 this evening. They knew Zuri took the bus home from her magnet school and usually arrived at the gate by 3:30. They timed this perfectly. They waited until I was states away, locked the deadbolts, disabled the keypad, and let a 9-year-old girl walk up to a frozen gate in 15-degree weather. They left my child on the sidewalk for hours, just to ensure I returned to a crisis. They wanted me panicked. They wanted me broken. Connor found a cash buyer. I scoffed, the sound sharp and bitter in the quiet car. Connor was a mediocre real estate flipper who spent more time adjusting his golf swing than analyzing market trends. He married my sister Chloe 3 years ago and suddenly believed he was the savior of our family finances. And Brenda ate it up. She practically worshipped the ground he walked on, treating his every word like gospel simply because he fit the image she wanted to project to her friends at church. A wealthy white son-in-law who was going to elevate the family name and bring them a new level of social status. And Chloe needs the capital to fund her new lifestyle brand. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Chloe, the golden child. The one who never had to struggle a day in her life. The one who Brenda shielded from every consequence, every hardship, and every reality check. Chloe wanted to start a lifestyle brand selling overpriced candles and wellness journals, so my mother decided to render her eldest daughter and her granddaughter homeless to fund it. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the headrest. The heater blasted warm air over my face, but a cold fury was setting into my bones. The familiarity of this betrayal was what stung the most. It was a pattern, a relentless cycle that had defined my entire existence in this family. Just like when you drained my college fund to pay for Chloe's destination wedding, I muttered, staring at the text message. I was 20 years old, working 2 jobs to pay my tuition, while Brenda quietly emptied the savings account my late father had set up for me. When I found out her excuse was that Chloe deserved a magical day in Cabo, and I was smart enough to figure out student loans on my own. You think I am still that defenseless 20-year-old girl? You think I am still the scapegoat who will just put her head down and take the abuse for the sake of family peace? I could picture the scene at the brownstone earlier today, Connor pacing the original hardwood floors, barking orders at moving companies. Chloe standing in the kitchen, complaining about how stressful it is to manage a real estate transaction while picking out fabrics for her brand launch. And Brenda orchestrating the entire thing, validating their greed with her twisted maternal logic. I could almost hear Brenda telling them that I was a strong black woman who always figures things out. That was her favorite excuse for neglecting me. My resilience was their free pass to be ruthless. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had backed me into a corner, forcing me to scramble for a cramped apartment while they cashed a massive check. They expected my phone call. They wanted the satisfaction of hearing the desperation in my voice, the panic of a mother trying to shield her child from the streets. Brenda wanted me to beg. She wanted to exert her ultimate control to remind me that no matter how hard I worked, I was still at her mercy. But I was no longer the girl they could easily discard. The past 15 years of my life had been spent navigating the brutal male-dominated world of commercial real estate. I had faced down ruthless developers, hostile city zoning boards, and predatory investors. I had built a holding company from the ground up, utilizing layers of limited liability companies and blind trusts to acquire prime Chicago real estate. I appraised properties during the day and bought them quietly at night. I was fluent in the language of contracts, liens, deeds, and financial leverage. My family saw the tailored suits and the nice car, but they never asked about the actual substance of my career. To them, I was just a glorified administrative worker who looked at houses. They vastly underestimated the predator they had just invited into their lives. The setup was flawless on their end, or so they thought. Connor thought he had orchestrated a brilliant off-market cash deal to flip a generational property in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. Brenda thought she had secured her golden child financial future while simultaneously punishing the daughter who refused to conform to her rigid expectations. I looked over at Zuri. She had fallen asleep, the rhythmic hum of the engine and the blast of the heater finally calming her exhausted little body. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away. This was not the time for tears. This was the time for execution. They wanted a war over real estate. They picked a fight with a woman who owned the battlefield. Let them celebrate tonight, I thought, staring at the arrogant sold sign through the icy windshield. Let Connor brag about his negotiation skills. Let Chloe browse luxury catalogs for her fictitious brand. Let Brenda go to church on Sunday and accept the quiet praise of the congregation for securing her family legacy. They were dancing on a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. I stared at Brenda's text message for another long moment. The cursor blinked steadily, waiting for my response. I did not give her the satisfaction of my anger. I did not demand an explanation. I did not threaten them with police or lawyers. That kind of reaction is for people who lack leverage. I slowly tapped the screen, preparing to initiate a sequence of events that would systematically dismantle their entire lives. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen of my phone. 2 letters. That was all they deserved. Okay. I hit send. I did not add a period. I did not add a question mark. I did not ask for an explanation or demand to know where my belongings were. I just let those 2 letters fly through the digital space and land directly in my mother's inbox. I knew exactly what would happen on the other end. Brenda would be sitting at a table with Chloe and Connor, surrounded by her enablers, holding her phone and waiting eagerly for the explosion. She would be bracing for the paragraphs of rage, the desperate pleas, the crying voicemails. She wanted the satisfaction of ignoring my frantic calls. When all she received was a calm, flat acknowledgement of receipt, it would drive her absolutely insane. A narcissist feeds on your panic. When you starve them of a reaction, they begin to suffocate on their own malice. Next to me in the passenger seat, Zuri shifted under my heavy wool coat. Her breathing had finally steadied, and the terrifying blue tint was leaving her lips. She blinked her eyes open, looking around the dark interior of the SUV. The memory of the freezing gate hit her, and she sat up quickly, panic flashing across her young face. "Mommy, where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are we really homeless?" "Grandma said we do not have a house anymore and that I had to wait outside." I reached over and gently smoothed her hair back from her forehead. I kept my voice incredibly calm and steady, masking the absolute fury that was burning in my chest. "Listen to me, Zuri. We are absolutely not homeless. Your grandmother and your aunt made a very poor choice today, but it is not going to affect us. I have been preparing for a day like this for a long time. We have plenty of places to go, places that are much nicer and much warmer than that old brownstone. We are going to go to our real home tonight." I put the SUV in gear and pulled away from the icy curb. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The sold sign stood there in the snow, a monument to Connor U.S. arrogance and Brenda U.S. betrayal. I felt no sadness leaving it behind. They thought they had ripped my roots out of the ground, but they did not understand that I owned the soil. We drove north through the city, leaving the south side behind. The harsh Chicago winter raged outside, whipping snow across the dark streets. But inside my car, it was warm and completely secure. I watched the neighborhoods transition from historic residential blocks to the gleaming glass and steel towers of downtown. While Connor was playing amateur house flipper, bragging about a single residential sale, I had spent the last decade quietly acquiring institutional-grade commercial assets. I steered us toward the Gold Coast, navigating the vehicle down a private ramp and approaching the secure gates of a prestigious luxury high-rise. The building was a modern fortress of exclusivity, a place where corporate titans and elite athletes lived. It was also a building where one of my anonymous limited liability companies owned the top-floor penthouse free and clear. I pulled up to the heated underground valet station. The heavy garage doors closed behind us, blocking out the wind and the snow completely. A uniformed attendant named Julian stepped forward to open my door. "Good evening, Miss Kendra," he said with a warm professional smile. "We have your suite fully prepared. I instructed them to turn the ambient heating up just as you prefer." "Thank you, Julian," I replied, stepping out into the pristine, brightly lit garage. I walked around to the passenger side and helped Zuri out. She clutched her small school backpack, staring up at the massive concrete pillars and the rows of exotic cars parked nearby. We walked to the private elevator bank. I swiped a sleek black keycard and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator shot upward in near silence. When the doors parted, we stepped directly into the grand foyer of the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living space, showcasing a breathtaking, unobstructed view of Lake Michigan and the illuminated Chicago skyline. The floors were rich polished hardwood, and the air was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of cedar and vanilla. Zuri dropped her backpack, her eyes wide with absolute wonder. "Mommy, whose house is this?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the massive open-concept living room. It belongs to us, baby, I told her, helping her take off my oversized coat. I have a few properties like this around the city, but I think this one will be our favorite. Why do you not go down the hall and pick out which bedroom you want? They all have their own bathrooms. Then we can order room service. You can have whatever you want for dinner, even dessert in bed tonight. She let out a small squeal of excitement and took off down the wide hallway, the trauma of the freezing cold gate already fading from her resilient mind. I stood alone in the center of the living room looking out over the glittering city below. I thought about Brenda Connor and Chloe. They believed they had thrown me out into the bitter cold to struggle and beg. They had no idea I was currently standing hundreds of feet above them in a property worth 10 times the brownstone they were so proud of stealing. They had played their opening move relying on cruelty and surprise. But they had fundamentally miscalculated who they were dealing with. They had forced my hand, and now I was going to play mine. I walked over to the kitchen island, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and pulled out my phone to begin the first phase of their absolute financial ruin. I closed the heavy oak door of the master suite, leaving Zuri nestled in the center of a massive king-sized bed. She was wrapped in a plush monogrammed robe, happily dunking truffle fries into ketchup while a cartoon played on the 80-inch television. The contrast between her current absolute comfort and the freezing wrought iron gate she had been abandoned at just an hour ago settled over me like a heavy blanket. The penthouse was a fortress of soundproofed glass and radiant heated floors. The harsh Chicago blizzard howling against the windows was reduced to a mere visual display. She was safe. She was fed. She was completely insulated from the viciousness of the people who shared our blood. That alone validated every grueling 80-hour workweek, every brutal negotiation, and every calculated real estate acquisition I had made over the last 10 years. I walked back into the expansive living room, my heels completely silent against the thick custom rugs. I poured myself a generous pour of a vintage Cabernet from the climate-controlled wine wall and sank into a velvet armchair overlooking the glittering grid of the city. My phone lay on the marble coffee table, vibrating with a relentless, frantic energy. It was time to see exactly how Brenda was spinning her betrayal. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. My family operates like a well-oiled political machine when it comes to character assassination, and they had not wasted a single minute. By the time I opened my messages, Brenda had already deployed her narrative to every corner of our social circle, our extended family, and her highly influential church congregation. I opened the family group chat first. It was a chaotic battlefield of misplaced righteous indignation. Aunt Denise sent a long message telling me that my bitter attitude was going to keep me single forever, and that I needed to seek the Lord to cleanse my heart of jealousy. My cousin Malik texted that I was acting like a stereotypical angry woman and that I should not be taking my own personal failures out on my younger sister. They were all lecturing me, scolding me for a situation I had supposedly created. I swiped out of the chat and opened Facebook. There it was, Brenda's masterpiece. She had tagged Chloe and Connor in a lengthy, meticulously crafted post, complete with a background of praying hands and a photo of the three of them smiling warmly. It breaks a mother's heart to make hard choices, the post read, but sometimes you have to protect your peace and the peace of your household. Chloe and Connor have worked so tirelessly for their beautiful union and their new business venture. It is simply devastating when your own flesh and blood refuses to support a loving interracial marriage out of pure spite and jealousy. Today, I had to make the agonizing decision to ask Kendra to leave my home. I cannot allow her toxic, angry energy to bring down this family's blessings anymore. We must cut off dead weight to fly. Please keep my eldest daughter in your prayers so her spirit may find healing and she can learn to be a supportive sister. It was brilliantly, sickeningly manipulative. Brenda had hit every single cultural and emotional trigger available to her. She weaponized the angry black woman stereotype against her own daughter to an audience that was primed to believe it. She painted my supposed eviction not as a greedy, calculated cash grab, but as a necessary act of maternal tough love to protect her youngest child from my relentless negativity. She even used Connor's race as a convenient shield, suggesting my anger was rooted in bigotry, rather than the objective fact that he was an incompetent freeloader trying to profit off our family home. They actually thought this would work. They genuinely believed that public shaming would break me. In the past, the threat of being ostracized by the church community and whispered about by the extended family would have sent me into a desperate spiral of apologies and frantic people-pleasing. I would have internalized their accusations, begged for forgiveness, and wondered what I did wrong to make my own mother hate me so much. But tonight, reading those comments rolling in from church members praising Brenda for her strength and offering prayers for my troubled soul, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical focus. I did not reply to a single text. I did not leave a comment defending myself on Facebook. I did not post a frantic counter-narrative. Engaging in a digital shouting match is what poor negotiators do when they lack actual leverage. Instead, I took quiet, methodical screenshots of every single message, every comment, and every post. I saved them to a secure cloud folder on my business server. This was no longer just family drama. This was a documented paper trail of Brenda establishing a fraudulent narrative on the exact same day she and Connor were attempting to push through a shady multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. My phone buzzed again, this time with an Instagram notification. Chloe had just posted a story. I tapped her profile. The video showed her holding a glass of champagne, leaning heavily against Connor's shoulder in a dim, luxurious setting. The camera panned to show a massive tomahawk steak being sliced at their table. The caption read, "Celebrating new beginnings and protecting our peace. So blessed to have a husband who navigates the market and takes care of this family." I paused the video and zoomed in on the background. I recognized the distinctive mahogany paneling and the custom brass light fixtures immediately. It was an exclusive reservations-only steakhouse located right in the heart of the River North District. It was less than 4 blocks away from my penthouse. They were celebrating my supposed homelessness with $1,000 dinners and vintage champagne, likely paying for it with credit cards they fully intended to pay off the second the brownstone sale closed on Friday. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. They wanted to celebrate their new beginnings. They wanted to perform their perfect, successful family routine in public. They wanted to toast to their brilliant business acumen. I stood up from the velvet armchair and walked over to my master closet. I bypassed my standard conservative appraisal suits and walked straight toward the back. I pulled out a tailored emerald green designer sheath dress that commanded absolute attention the second you walked into a room. I paired it with my highest stilettos and a diamond tennis bracelet that cost more than Connor made in an entire fiscal year. If they wanted to play a highly visible game of perception, I was more than happy to join the party. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror. I looked wealthy, unbothered, and utterly lethal. I pulled up the contact for my elite overnight nanny service, a highly vetted agency I utilized for late-night corporate dinners. Within 30 minutes, a certified caregiver named Sarah arrived at the penthouse. Zuri was already fast asleep in the guest suite, full of room service and completely at peace. I grabbed my sleek black leather portfolio from my work bag. Inside was the one legally binding document that was about to turn their celebratory dinner into a catastrophic nightmare. I stepped into the private elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the polished stone floor. Brenda wanted to paint me as the toxic, angry woman who ruined the family peace. I was not angry. I was simply the bank calling in its debts. The ride from my high-rise to the River North District took less than 10 minutes in the back of my private car service. As the sleek, black vehicle glided through the snow-covered streets, I kept my phone illuminated in my hand, reviewing the digital breadcrumbs Chloe had so carelessly left behind. She had never been able to keep a secret, especially not one that involved pretending she was wealthy. Her Instagram stories were a roadmap of their entire evening. She had tagged the exact private dining room at the Wellington, one of the most exclusive steakhouses in the city. The posts showed close-up shots of vintage champagne bottles, the massive seafood towers, and Connor raising his glass with a smug, victorious grin. The caption read, "Closing dinner with the best husband." He flipped the family brownstone and secured the bag. Next stop, lifestyle brand launch. They were literally eating up the equity of our family history, assuming I was somewhere freezing on a sidewalk with my daughter. My driver pulled up to the valet stand. The freezing wind whipped around my legs as I stepped out, but I barely felt it. The emerald green sheath dress fit me like armor, and the adrenaline pumping through my veins provided all the heat I needed. I handed my coat to the coat check attendant and stepped into the main dining room. The Wellington was dark and opulent, smelling of aged beefwood smoke and expensive cologne. It was the kind of place where corporate takeovers were celebrated and million-dollar deals were struck over rare bourbon. It was my arena. I bypassed the hostess stand, ignoring the young woman who tried to ask if I had a reservation. I knew exactly where the private dining rooms were located because I had hosted my own corporate acquisition dinners in those exact same suites. I walked down the dimly lit hallway, my stilettos clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The sound was sharp and deliberate, announcing my arrival before I even reached the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom suite. I stopped just outside the doors. They were cracked open slightly, allowing the warm golden light and the arrogant sounds of their celebration to spill out into the hallway. I did not enter immediately. I stood perfectly still in the shadows and listened to the man who thought he had just outsmarted me. Connor was holding court at the head of the long table, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a mediocre man who had just stumbled into a pile of money. "You really have to understand the nuances of the urban market," Connor was saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is all about recognizing the untapped potential in these distressed neighborhoods." The brownstone was a prime asset, but it was just sitting there doing nothing for the family. It takes a certain kind of vision to step in, navigate the urban landscape, and extract the maximum capital. You cannot be emotional about real estate. You have to be shrewd. I felt my jaw tighten. Distressed neighborhoods. Untapped potential. He was talking about the community my grandparents had helped build. He was talking about the home my father had meticulously maintained until the day he died. Connor spoke about our family history as if he had just discovered an abandoned gold mine in a savage land. He was playing the white savior of black generational wealth, and the most sickening part was that my own mother was sitting right next to him eating it up. "You are so right, Connor," I heard Brenda say, her voice thick with admiration and misplaced pride. "We just needed a strong man with actual business sense to step up and take charge." Kendra was always too emotional, too attached to the past. She never understood how to leverage assets. "You came in and secured Chloe a future. You are a blessing to this family." Chloe chimed in, her voice high-pitched and overly enthusiastic. "Exactly. Kendra was just letting the house rot while she worked her little office job. Now I finally have the seed money for my wellness brand." Connor handled the cash buyer perfectly. No inspections, no waiting, just pure profit. They clinked their heavy crystal glasses together, celebrating their flawless crime. They were toasting to my ruin, using the money they thought they had stolen from me to buy tomahawk steaks and imported wine. The sheer delusion of their conversation was almost intoxicating. Connor actually believed his basic internet research and amateur negotiation tactics had secured a multi-million-dollar deal. Brenda actually believed she had finally outsmarted her rebellious independent daughter. Chloe actually believed she was about to become a wealthy entrepreneur. I placed my hand against the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door. I took one slow, deep breath, letting the cold, analytical focus settle completely over my mind. Then I pushed the doors wide open. The heavy wood swung silently on its hinges, but my entrance hit the room like a physical shockwave. I stepped into the warm glow of the private suite, the emerald green dress catching the light, the diamonds on my wrist flashing as I rested my hand on the back of an empty leather chair at the opposite end of the table. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The laughter died in their throats. The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped mid-air. The warm, triumphant atmosphere of the room shattered into a million jagged pieces. Brenda was the first to see me. The wine glass she was raising halfway to her lips froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. Her eyes darted from my perfectly styled hair to my expensive dress, to the calm, terrifyingly blank expression on my face. She had expected a broken, homeless woman in tear-stained clothes. She was entirely unprepared for the apex predator standing at the end of her table. Chloe dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her plate, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. She shrank back into her chair, her spoiled, confident demeanor vanishing the second she made eye contact with me. Connor was sitting at the head of the table, a napkin tucked into his collar, a massive piece of steak halfway to his mouth. He blinked uncomprehendingly, as if trying to calculate how the woman he had just locked out in the freezing snow was standing in one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago, looking like she owned the entire building. I did not say a word. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch out, letting their panic rise, letting the reality of my presence completely dismantle their celebration. I slowly pulled out the heavy leather chair and took a seat directly across from Connor. I crossed my legs, rested my sleek black portfolio on the white tablecloth, and offered them a smooth, chilling smile. "Please," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, carrying effortlessly across the long table. "Do not let me interrupt the closing dinner. I would love to hear more about your shrewd navigation of the urban market, Connor. It sounds absolutely fascinating." The heavy silence in the private dining room was absolute. For a long, unbroken moment, the only sound was the faint ambient jazz playing from a hidden speaker and the distant clatter of the main restaurant kitchen. Connor stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the flush of expensive bourbon and sudden panic creeping up his neck. He was a man accustomed to dominating rooms through sheer volume and assumed authority, but my sudden appearance had completely short-circuited his performance. He looked at my designer dress, my flawless composure, and the sleek leather portfolio resting under my manicured hands. His brain was desperately trying to reconcile the image of the defeated single mother he thought he had evicted with the formidable woman currently commanding his table. He recovered first, masking his initial shock with a thick layer of unearned corporate bravado. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, and put on his best condescending peacemaker voice. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the white tablecloth, as if he were about to negotiate a minor discrepancy with a subordinate. "Now, Kendra, there is absolutely no need for hostility." He began, using the placating tone of a man who believes he is the smartest person in any given room. "I know you are feeling emotional right now, and I understand change is difficult. But we need to look at this from a purely rational business perspective. We all know you have a nice little job appraising properties for the bank, but the investment side of real estate, the actual high-level asset management, is a completely different beast. You cannot let sentimentality blind you to market realities." I simply watched him. I did not blink. I did not interrupt. I let him dig his own grave with his own arrogant tongue. The brownstone was an illiquid asset. Connor continued gaining confidence from my silence. It was just sitting there, trapping generational wealth in brick and mortar. The neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly, and the cash offer I secured was aggressively above market value. I facilitated a liquidity event for the family. As someone who works on the fringes of the industry, you should be thanking me for maximizing the family portfolio instead of barging in here trying to cause a scene. He actually believed the words coming out of his mouth. He thought he was giving a masterclass in urban development to a woman who secretly owned millions of dollars in commercial square footage directly beneath his feet. Brenda, emboldened by her white son-in-law taking charge, immediately went on the offensive. She slammed her hand flat against the table, her heavy gold rings clanking against the wood. Her eyes narrowed, taking in my calm demeanor with absolute contempt. She was furious that I was not providing the hysterical, sobbing reaction she had spent all afternoon anticipating. "Connor is exactly right," Brenda snapped, her voice laced with venom. "And you need to stop acting like a bitter scapegoat, Kendra. You came barging into a private celebration trying to ruin your sister a blessing just because you are unhappy with your own life choices. We made a financial decision for the betterment of the family. You have always been entirely too attached to that old house. You locked your 9-year-old granddaughter out in 15-degree weather," I said. My voice was quiet, but the razor-sharp edge to it made Chloe flinch in her seat. You let her wait at a frozen gate for 4 hours. Brenda waved her hand dismissively, completely unfazed by the cruelty of her own actions. Oh, please stop with the dramatics. I told the girl to wait for you. A little cold builds character. You are raising her to be entirely too soft. You are a strong black woman, Kendra. You have always boasted about how independent you are. So be independent, hustle, and figure it out. You can find a nice little apartment somewhere that fits your budget. God will provide for you and Zuri if you just prey on that dark spirit of jealousy you harbor against your sister. The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. Brenda weaponized church rhetoric like a seasoned politician twisting faith and cultural expectations to justify her own greed. She invoked the strong black woman trope to absolve herself of any maternal responsibility or basic human decency. In her twisted mind, my resilience was a free pass for her abuse. Because she believed I could survive anything, she felt entirely justified in throwing me to the wolves. Pastor Thomas was just saying last Sunday how we must elevate those who are meant for greatness. Brenda continued, nodding toward Chloe and Connor. This is Chloe, a season of elevation. She has a vision. She has a supportive husband who actually understands how to navigate the business world. They needed the capital to launch her brand. You should be down on your knees thanking the Lord that your sister is stepping into her purpose, instead of standing here dripping in resentment. Chloe finally found her voice safely tucked behind the shield of her mother, a blatant favoritism, and her husband a supposed business acumen. She picked up her crystal champagne flute and took a delicate sip, offering me a smug, entitled smirk over the rim of the glass. It is just real estate, Kendra. Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You always make everything so difficult. My wellness brand launches next month. I need the cash flow for inventory marketing and the influencer retreat. You know how important this is to me. Connor was just looking out for my future because nobody else was doing anything with that property. You can easily rent a place closer to Zuri's school. It is honestly a win for everyone. You just need to stop playing the victim. I absorbed their words, letting the sheer weight of their delusion wash over me. They sat there draped in expensive clothing, dining on exorbitant meals funded by imaginary profits, convinced they had outmaneuvered me. Connor believed he was a financial genius. Brenda believed she was a righteous matriarch securing her family a legacy. Chloe believed she was a brilliant entrepreneur who deserved a massive cash injection simply for existing. They had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was nothing but a minor obstacle, a bitter, uneducated spectator to their phenomenal success. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my lack of screaming meant they had won the argument. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply allowing them to incriminate themselves, finalizing the exact parameters of their impending destruction. I looked at Connor, a smug face, then at Chloe, a entitled smirk, and finally at the cold, calculating eyes of the mother who had traded her own flesh and blood for a seat at a steakhouse table. The trap was fully set, and it was finally time to spring it. I remained perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room. Connor shifted uncomfortably, his previous bluster evaporating under the intensity of my gaze. Brenda's hand dropped from the table, her knuckles white. Chloe was staring at her phone, desperate to find an escape from the suffocating tension. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology. I simply lifted a finger, catching the eye of the sommelier who was hovering nervously near the entrance of the private suite. He approached immediately, his expression a mix of professional courtesy and sheer terror at the palpable hostility in the room. "Good evening," I said, my voice smooth and relaxed. "I believe we are celebrating a highly lucrative real estate transaction tonight. I would like to order a bottle of your finest vintage, the 1990 Domaine de la Romanée Conti, if you have it in the cellar." The sommelier's eyes widened slightly. That particular bottle was legendary, easily running upward of $5,000. He glanced hesitantly at Connor, who was officially the host of the dinner. "Put it on his tab," I instructed, nodding toward my brother-in-law. He just secured a massive cash deal for the family. He is feeling incredibly generous. Connor opened his mouth to protest, a flush of genuine panic replacing his earlier arrogance, but Brenda shot him a sharp look. She was desperate to maintain the illusion of control, to prove that this expense was nothing more than a minor annoyance. She gave the sommelier a tight, strained smile. "That will be fine," Brenda said, her voice brittle. "Bring the wine." The sommelier bowed quickly and practically fled the room. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers and resting them on my lap. The disconnect between their expectations and my reality was beginning to fracture Brenda's composure. She had anticipated a broken, sobbing woman, desperate for a place to sleep and begging for scraps of familial mercy. Instead, I was sitting across from them in a designer dress, ordering a $5,000 bottle of wine on their dime, completely unfazed by the fact that they had just locked my child out in the snow. "You are acting very strangely, Kendra," Brenda finally said, the church lady facade slipping to reveal the cold, calculating woman underneath. "If you think running up Connor's bill is going to change the fact that you need to find a new place to live, you are deeply mistaken. This childish behavior is exactly why I had to make the difficult decision to remove you from my home." "Your home?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I tilted my head, studying her as if she were a fascinating, slightly defective puzzle. "That is an interesting choice of words, Mother." Connor, attempting to regain his footing, jumped back into the conversation. "It is her home, Kendra. She is the matriarch. She holds the deed. And as her son-in-law and financial advisor, I determined that liquidating that asset was the most strategic move for her future and for Chloe's brand launch." "Ah yes, Chloe's lifestyle brand," I said, turning my attention to my sister. She shrank back slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Wellness journals and overpriced candles, wasn't it funded by the sudden aggressive sale of a generational brownstone?" "It is a legitimate business plan," Chloe snapped, her voice defensive and high-pitched. "I have a vision. Connor believes in me. Mom believes in me. You are just jealous because you are stuck appraising other people's properties while I am building an empire." "An empire built on stolen equity," I observed quietly. I reached out and gently traced the rim of an empty crystal water glass. "You know, Connor, for a man who claims to be a real estate genius, you are remarkably reckless. You rushed a cash buyer into a closing without doing even the most basic due diligence." Connor sneered, his confidence returning now that we were supposedly back in his territory. "I know exactly what I am doing. I pulled the comps, I negotiated a premium price. The title is clear, and the closing is scheduled for Friday morning. The funds will be wired directly into Brenda's account by noon." I stopped tracing the glass. I looked up and met his eyes, letting the full force of my absolute certainty hit him. "The title is not clear, Connor." The words hung in the air. The room went completely still. "What are you talking about?" Brenda demanded, her voice sharp with sudden apprehension. "Of course the title is clear. My name is on the deed." I did not answer her. Instead, I reached for the sleek black leather portfolio resting on the table in front of me. I slid my hand over the smooth surface, the only sound in the room the faint rustle of my sleeve. "When you list a property for a multi-million-dollar cash sale, Connor." I began, my tone shifting from conversational to clinical. "It is generally considered best practice to pull a comprehensive title report. Not just a basic search, but a deep dive into any encumbrances, liens, or secondary claims on the asset. Because if you fail to disclose a massive financial encumbrance to a cash buyer, you are not just breaching a contract, you are committing fraud." Connor's face lost all its color. He looked from me to the black folder, then back to me. "There are no liens," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous bravado. "I checked the public records. Brenda owns it free and clear." I pushed the black folder across the white tablecloth. It slid smoothly, stopping precisely in the center of the table, equidistant from Brenda, Connor, and Chloe. "You should really look inside, Connor," I suggested softly. "Consider it a free lesson in high-level asset management." Connor hesitated for a fraction of a second. His large hands, previously so animated as he boasted about his financial prowess, now seemed heavy and clumsy. He reached out and flipped open the thick cover of the black portfolio. The crisp white parchment paper inside caught the warm light of the chandelier overhead. At the top of the first page, the official blue and gold seal of the Cook County Recorder of Deeds stared back at him. I watched his eyes dart across the dense legal text. I could trace the exact moment his brain stopped processing the words as a minor annoyance and started comprehending them as a catastrophic threat. His jaw went slack. The smug flush on his cheeks drained away, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. "What is it?" Brenda demanded. She craned her neck, trying to peer over his shoulder, her heavy gold earrings swinging with the abrupt movement. "Connor, what did she bring in here?" Connor did not answer her. He flipped to the second page, his hands visibly shaking now. He was reading the promissory note. Then he flipped to the third page, which contained the notarized and officially recorded lien. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. "This is a commercial lien," he said, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. "It is registered to an entity called Apex Holdings, LLC. It is a $500,000 encumbrance on the property." Chloe let out a sharp, confused laugh. "Oh, what? Connor, speak English. What does that mean for my money?" "It means," I said, leaning forward slightly, "that your brilliant husband failed to perform the most fundamental step of real estate acquisition. Due diligence. You checked the basic municipal tax records, did you not, Connor? You saw Brenda's name on the deed, and you saw that the original 30-year mortgage had been satisfied. You saw dollar signs. You assumed you were dealing with a free and clear generational asset. But you were too cheap to hire a thorough commercial title company before you listed the property. If you had, you would have found the secondary commercial lien attached to the estate." Brenda slammed her hand on the table again, but this time there was no power behind it, only panic. "That is a lie. I own that house free and clear. My husband left me that house." "He left you the house," I corrected, keeping my tone conversational but lethal. "He also left you a substantial life insurance policy, which you managed to burn through in less than 10 years, trying to keep up appearances at church and funding Chloe's lavish lifestyle. 5 years ago, you were 3 months behind on the property taxes and facing imminent foreclosure. You came crying to me because you were terrified your congregation would find out you were broke." Chloe turned to her mother, her eyes wide with shock. "Mom, is that true? You were broke?" Brenda refused to look at her golden child. Her gaze was locked on me, burning with a mixture of profound embarrassment and visceral hatred. "You said you were helping me," she hissed through clenched teeth. "You brought me a stack of papers to sign to clear the taxes and get the city off my back. You said you were stepping up to do your duty as a daughter." "I did step up," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "I paid off the city. I settled your outstanding debts. I saved you from public humiliation and losing the only asset this family had left. But I am a commercial real estate investor, Mother. I do not hand out $500,000 in unsecured cash. Not to anyone. Especially not to the woman who stole my college tuition. You signed a legally binding commercial loan agreement. You pledged the brownstone as collateral against the funds I provided through Apex Holdings, LLC. You gave me a lien. And because you have not made a single repayment in 5 years, the penalty interest has been compounding." Connor finally looked up from the documents. His eyes were wide with a terror that I found deeply satisfying. "You are the registered agent for Apex Holdings." "I am the sole proprietor," I confirmed with a brief nod. Chloe threw her hands up in exasperation, completely failing to grasp the gravity of the legal trap they were currently sitting in. "Okay, fine," she whined, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "So Kendra loaned you some money years ago. Big deal. Connor, we are selling the house for nearly $2 million in cash, right? So we just pay her back her stupid loan out of the profits, and I take the rest for my brand. Why is everyone freaking out?" Connor turned to his wife, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Chloe, shut up," he snapped. "You do not understand what is happening right now." "Excuse me?" Chloe gasped, her face flushing bright red. "Do not talk to me like that." "We signed a seller's disclosure," Connor said, his voice rising in panic as he ignored her outrage. He looked frantically between Brenda and the black folder. When we accepted the cash offer, we signed a legally binding disclosure stating that the property was free of any liens, claims, or encumbrances. We guaranteed a clean title to the buyer. The closing is on Friday morning. If we cannot deliver a clean title, we are in breach of contract. So just pay the lien, Chloe argued, her voice piercing and shrill. We cannot clear a commercial lien in 2 days without the lien holder's explicit cooperation, Connor practically shouted, running a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. The title company will flag it tomorrow when they do the final pre-closing check. The buyer will walk away, they will take their earnest money back, and then they will sue me for fraud because I am the listing agent who facilitated a fraudulent contract. I could lose my brokerage license. I could be taken to court for damages. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on the table, crushing the last remaining fragments of their celebration. The vintage champagne sitting in the ice bucket beside them suddenly looked like poison. The extravagant cuts of meat on their plates were turning cold. Brenda's chest began to heave as her breathing turned shallow and rapid. The carefully constructed facade of the untouchable matriarch was disintegrating right in front of my eyes. She turned her panicked gaze to me and attempted to deploy the one weapon she had relied on her entire life: maternal authority. Kendra, you will lift this lien immediately, Brenda commanded, though her voice shook so badly it ruined the effect. I am your mother. You will not do this to your family. You will call your lawyers right now and clear this title so your sister can get her money and Connor can close this deal. I demand it. I rested my elbows on the arms of my leather chair and looked at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the deep lines of entitlement etched into her face. I thought about the text message she had sent me just a few hours ago. I thought about Zuri sitting on her frozen backpack crying in the snow. You demand it, I asked, my voice dropping an octave, chilling the air between us. You lock my 9-year-old daughter out of her home in the dead of a Chicago winter. You leave her shivering at a gate for 4 hours. You send me a text message gloating about making us homeless. And now you sit here in a private steakhouse suite demanding that I dissolve a $500,000 legal claim to save your son-in-law from a fraud conviction. I stood up slowly, towering over the table. My emerald green dress caught the dim lighting, making me look like a force of nature they had no hope of containing. The time for family favors expired the exact second my daughter was left freezing in the snow. I said, my voice perfectly steady, delivering the absolute finality of my decision. I am not lifting the lien. I am calling it in. The loan is in default. Apex Holdings is officially executing its right to demand full and immediate repayment of the principal plus 5 years of compounding penalty interest. Connor dropped his head into his hands, pulling at his hair. Oh my God, he muttered. Oh my God, we are ruined. Chloe was hyperventilating now, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. But my brand, she sobbed, looking frantically at her mother. Mom, you promised me that money. You promised I could launch my business. What am I supposed to do now? Brenda reached out a trembling hand toward me, her previous authority completely shattered. Kendra, please. You cannot do this. We will lose everything. The buyer will sue Connor. They will take the house anyway to settle the damages. We will be left with nothing. I am your mother. Please. I picked up my sleek black portfolio and tucked it neatly under my arm. I looked down at the three of them sitting in the wreckage of their own arrogant greed. You told me I needed to hustle and figure it out, I reminded her, quoting her own toxic advice right back to her. So figure it out. Prey on it. Use that strong black woman resilience you love to talk about so much. I turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I did not look back. As I grasped the brass handles to leave the room, I paused and offered them one final piece of parting advice. I suggest you start packing, Brenda. The closing on Friday is going to be incredibly educational. I pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut behind me, and the solid click of the brass latch sealed my family inside the tomb of their own making. The ambient jazz of the main dining room washed over me, replacing the suffocating silence of the private suite. I walked past the hostess stand, my emerald green dress moving with fluid purpose. I handed my ticket to the coat check attendant, slipped my arms into my heavy wool coat, and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The valet brought my SUV around, and as I tipped him and slid behind the heated leather steering wheel, a profound sense of tranquility settled over my entire body. I drove back to the penthouse in total silence. I did not need music. The mental image of Connor panicking over a fraudulent real estate contract was the greatest symphony I had ever heard. When I woke up the next morning, the panoramic view of Lake Michigan was completely obscured by a dense, swirling blizzard. Inside the penthouse, however, it was perfectly warm and serene. I brewed a double espresso in the custom kitchen and checked my phone. The digital smear campaign from the previous evening had vanished completely. Brenda had deleted her long, manipulative Facebook post. Chloe had scrubbed her Instagram stories of any mention of their celebratory steakhouse dinner. They were in full damage control mode, desperately trying to erase any public evidence of the multi-million-dollar transaction they were about to default on. But while the women in my family chose silent panic, Connor chose loud, desperate aggression. I had 7 voicemails from him, all left between 2 and 4 in the morning. I tapped the first audio file and listened to the unraveling of an arrogant man. "Listen to me, Kendra." His voice crackled through the speaker, thick with panic and expensive bourbon. "You think you can play hardball with me. You think a single commercial lien is going to stop this closing. I know people on the zoning board. I know the partners at the major brokerages in this city. You are just a mid-level appraiser. I will have your license revoked by Monday morning if you do not sign a release of lien today. I will bury you in litigation. You do not know who you are messing with." I took a slow sip of my espresso, savoring the rich, bitter flavor. The voicemails progressed exactly as I predicted. The second and third were full of similar empty threats, invoking his imaginary network of old boys' club connections. By the 5th voicemail, the aggression began to fracture, turning into frantic bargaining. He offered to pay me $50,000 out of his own commission if I just lifted the encumbrance for 24 hours. By the 7th voicemail, he was practically hyperventilating, begging me to call him back because the buyer's attorney had requested an updated title commitment ahead of Friday morning. Connor thought he could intimidate me by threatening my appraisal license. He fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic. I did not work for a brokerage. I owned the holding companies that acquired the commercial spaces the brokerages leased. I tapped the screen, forwarding all 7 audio files directly to my general counsel, a ruthless corporate attorney named Harrison. I added a brief note instructing Harrison to prepare a formal cease and desist order and to begin drafting a lawsuit for harassment and attempted extortion. Connor was handing me the nails for his own coffin, and I was more than happy to use them. The rest of the day passed smoothly. I worked from my home office, finalizing the acquisition of a retail complex in the West Loop, while Zuri participated in her remote learning classes from the massive kitchen island. The silence from Brenda was the only thing that gave me pause. My mother was not the type of woman to quietly accept defeat. When a narcissist is backed into a corner and stripped of their financial resources, they do not surrender. They seek to destroy whatever the person who outsmarted them loves the most. I found out exactly how far my mother was willing to go at 4:00 that afternoon. The private elevator chime echoed through the penthouse, followed immediately by a call from the ground floor concierge. His voice was unusually tense. "Miss Kendra, I apologize for the interruption, but there are 2 agents from the Department of Family and Support Services here in the lobby. They are accompanied by a Chicago police officer. They are demanding access to your residence regarding a child welfare check." A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my veins, but my voice remained perfectly level. "Send them up, Julian." I hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen. Zuri was happily painting a solar system diorama, her hands covered in blue and purple acrylics. I kissed the top of her head and told her I had to speak with some visitors in the foyer for a few minutes. I walked to the entryway just as the heavy elevator doors parted. 2 caseworkers, a man and a woman, stepped into the foyer with a uniformed officer trailing closely behind them. They carried clipboards and wore expressions of grim determination, clearly prepared to intervene in a tragic situation. They looked up from their paperwork and stopped dead in their tracks. The agents blinked, taking in the sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse. They looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the blizzard over the skyline, the pristine hardwood floors and the original artwork hanging on the walls. Then they looked at me standing before them in cashmere loungewear, looking completely unbothered. Ma'am, the female caseworker started, her voice faltering as she checked the address on her clipboard again. Are you Kendra? I am, I replied, crossing my arms. Please come in. You can leave your snow boots on the mat. They stepped tentatively into the living room, exchanging highly confused glances. We received an anonymous emergency tip this morning, the male agent explained, recovering his professional tone, though he kept glancing around the opulent space. The caller reported a black woman and a 9-year-old girl who had been evicted and were currently living out of a freezing vehicle parked in an alleyway on the south side. The caller stated the mother was financially destitute, mentally unstable, and neglecting the child's basic needs. I felt a dangerous, lethal calm wash over me. Weaponizing the child welfare system against a black mother is the ultimate betrayal. It is a line that once crossed completely eradicates any remaining shred of familial loyalty. Brenda had realized that her public shaming failed and her financial manipulation failed. So she decided to unleash the state on my daughter, hoping the terror of having my child taken away would force me to surrender the real estate equity. I did not yell. I did not get defensive. I simply turned and gestured toward the open kitchen where Zuri was currently humming a song and painting a styrofoam planet. As you can see, my daughter is neither freezing nor neglected, I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. We are currently standing in a penthouse that I own free and clear. My refrigerator is fully stocked, the ambient temperature is a comfortable 72 degrees, and my daughter is thriving. I am a highly successful commercial real estate investor. The anonymous caller who provided you with this malicious fabricated report is my mother, Brenda. She is currently attempting to force through a fraudulent real estate transaction on a property that I hold a $500,000 lien against. She filed this false report to punish me for halting her illegal sale. The police officer let out a long, heavy sigh and shook his head, clearly realizing they had been used as pawns in a vicious family dispute. The caseworkers looked absolutely mortified. The female agent stepped forward, her posture entirely apologetic now. I am so sorry to have intruded on your home like this, she said, closing her clipboard. We are required by law to investigate every emergency claim, but it is abundantly clear that this report was made maliciously. Your daughter is perfectly safe, and this environment is exceptional. We will be closing this case immediately as unfounded. I am glad to hear that, I said, stepping toward them. But closing the case is not enough. Filing a false report with Child Protective Services is a crime. I intend to pursue this to the absolute fullest extent of the law. I want the unredacted intake report. The male caseworker shifted uncomfortably. We protect the anonymity of our callers, ma'am. It is agency policy to encourage reporting without fear of retaliation. I picked up my phone from the entryway table and dialed a number, placing it on speaker. It rang twice before my general counsel answered. Harrison. I said, my eyes locked on the caseworkers. I currently have 2 agents from the Department of Family and Support Services in my foyer, responding to a fabricated emergency claim made by Brenda. They are citing agency policy regarding the anonymity of the caller. Harrison's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged foyer, sharp and entirely devoid of patience. Put them on speaker, Kendra. Agents, my name is Harrison, and I am the lead corporate attorney for Apex Holdings. If you attempt to shield the identity of an individual who has just committed a criminal offense by filing a malicious false report against my client, I will have an emergency subpoena on your regional director desk before 5 o'clock today. You will release the intake phone number, or we will litigate your department for facilitating targeted harassment. The caseworkers exchanged another panicked look. The male agent quickly flipped through the pages on his clipboard, stopping at the initial intake form. He read the 10-digit phone number aloud. I nodded slowly, committing the numbers to memory. It was Brenda's personal cell phone number. She had not even been smart enough to use a burner phone. She was so blinded by her own arrogance and entitlement that she thought she could weaponize the system anonymously from the comfort of the home she was trying to steal from me. "Thank you," I said, ending the call with Harrison. "I appreciate your thoroughness. I will show you to the elevator." After the doors closed behind the authorities, I stood in the quiet foyer, letting the absolute magnitude of my mother's actions settle in. The gloves were completely off. There would be no family reconciliation. There would be no tense Thanksgiving dinners or awkward Christmas exchanges. Brenda had tried to take my child. I walked over to the floor to ceiling windows and looked out at the raging blizzard. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the closing day for the brownstone. Brenda, Chloe, and Connor were going to walk into a mahogany-paneled law office downtown, expecting a miracle. They were going to sit at a massive conference table sweating through their designer clothes, praying they could somehow negotiate their way out of the commercial lien and salvage their fraudulent multi-million-dollar cash deal. They were expecting to meet with the anonymous cash buyer who had aggressively outbid the market to secure the property. They had no idea that the buyer they were desperate to negotiate with was the very same woman they had just tried to destroy. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the kitchen, my mind locked onto the absolute financial execution I was about to deliver. Friday morning arrived with a blinding, freezing clarity. The severe blizzard had passed overnight, leaving the city of Chicago encased in a brilliant layer of ice and harsh winter sunshine. I stood in the master bathroom of my penthouse, adjusting the collar of a tailored charcoal gray suit. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who was perfectly rested, completely unbothered, and entirely focused. Today was the day of the closing. Today was the day the financial guillotine would drop. Before I could even pour my morning espresso, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the marble counter. The caller ID showed the name of the managing director at the boutique appraisal firm where I maintained my day job. I kept that job strictly for networking purposes and to maintain my unassuming cover, but my colleagues there knew and respected my actual capabilities. I answered the call and immediately heard the exhaustion in my director's voice. "Kendra," he said, sighing heavily into the receiver, "you have an extremely unhinged brother-in-law. He has been blowing up our main office lines since 6 o'clock this morning." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a cold wave of amusement wash over me. Connor had reached the bargaining and intimidation phase of his panic. Realizing he had absolutely no legal standing to force me to lift the commercial lien, he had decided to attack what he believed was my only source of livelihood. He managed to get the direct number for one of our senior partners. My director continued. "He has been leaving frantic voicemails claiming you are engaging in professional extortion. He is demanding that we terminate your employment immediately and threatening to report our firm to the state licensing board if we do not compel you to release an encumbrance on his mother-in-law's property. He is throwing around the names of a few mid-level developers he plays golf with, acting like he has the power to ruin our business." I smiled, looking out over the frozen lake. Connor was desperately trying to flex his imaginary muscles in a world he barely understood. He thought he could use his old boys' club connections to intimidate a black woman into submission. He assumed that because he was a white man with a real estate license, my superiors would automatically side with him and pressure me to surrender my assets to save my job. He had absolutely no idea that I generated more revenue for that firm through my independent corporate acquisitions than those senior partners made in an entire fiscal year. "Tell the partners to ignore him," I replied, keeping my voice smooth and untroubled. "I am handling the situation privately this morning. I apologize for the nuisance. We already blocked his number," the director said with a dismissive chuckle. "The man sounds completely desperate. Good luck today, Kendra." I ended the call and opened my own voicemail inbox. Connor had been equally relentless on my personal line. There were 5 new messages, all left in the frantic hours between midnight and dawn. I tapped the first audio file and set the phone on the kitchen island, letting his unraveling voice fill the quiet penthouse. Kendra, pick up the phone. His voice cracked under the suffocating pressure of his impending ruin. "You think you can play hardball with me. You think a single commercial lien is going to stop this closing. I just got off the phone with the senior partner at your firm. You are done. I am having your appraisal license revoked by the state board by noon today if you do not sign that release. You are playing with fire. Lift the lien, or I will make sure you never work in real estate again. The voicemails progressed from arrogant threats to outright begging. The reality of his situation had fully crystallized in his mind overnight. He knew that the buyer's attorney was preparing the final title commitment for the 10:00 closing. If Connor and Brenda walked into that law office today without a clear title, the cash buyer had the absolute legal right to sue Connor for fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of contract. Connor's broker would drop him instantly. His real estate license would be suspended, pending a state investigation, and the financial penalties for failing to disclose a $500,000 commercial encumbrance would bankrupt him completely. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or pity. I simply tapped the screen and forwarded every single audio file directly to Harrison, my general counsel. I added a quick note instructing him to append these voicemails to the growing harassment and extortion lawsuit we were building against Connor. Harrison replied within seconds, confirming receipt and noting that Connor was systematically destroying his own legal defense with every word he spoke. He was handing us a beautifully wrapped confession of attempted coercion. My phone vibrated again, this time with a frantic text message from Chloe. The golden child was finally cracking under the crushing weight of actual consequences. The shield of her mother's favoritism could not protect her from breach of contract litigation. "Kendra, please!" The text read, a desperate block of words devoid of her usual entitlement. Connor is losing his mind. The buyer's attorney sent a formal demand for performance last night. Connor says we are going to be sued for millions. Mom is completely shut down and will not get out of bed. Just lift the lien. I will give you a percentage of my brand revenue when it launches. I promise. Please do not ruin my life over an old grudge. I stared at the message, letting the sheer delusion of her offer wash over me. She was still trying to bargain with imaginary profits from a non-existent candle company to clear a $500,000 commercial debt. She genuinely believed that her completely fabricated lifestyle brand held actual value in the real world. She wanted me to surrender my financial security to save her from a disaster she had gleefully helped orchestrate. They had locked my 9-year-old daughter out in the freezing snow. They had called Child Protective Services with malicious intent, hoping the state would take my child away. And now, facing the absolute ruin of their own making, they were begging for mercy they had never once shown me. I deleted Chloe's text without responding. Silence is the most terrifying answer you can give a narcissist who is watching their world burn. I grabbed my black leather portfolio from the entryway table, checking to ensure all the necessary legal traps were securely inside. The original promissory note, the recorded lien, and the corporate documents proving my ownership of the purchasing entity were all there, perfectly organized. I checked in on Zuri, who was eating a warm breakfast prepared by the overnight nanny, laughing at a cartoon on the television. I kissed her forehead, promised her I would be back by lunch, and stepped into the private elevator. The valet had my car warmed and waiting in the underground garage. I slid into the back seat and gave my driver the address of the plush mahogany-paneled law office downtown. The drive through the city was smooth, the morning traffic parting around my vehicle as we navigated the icy streets. I watched the towering skyscrapers pass by, feeling a profound sense of absolute power. My family was currently sitting in a downtown conference room, sweating through their designer clothes, staring at the clock and praying for a miracle. They were hoping they could somehow force the sale through, beg the anonymous buyer for a massive extension, or negotiate their way out of the fraud they had committed. They were terrified of the faceless corporate entity that had aggressively outbid the market to secure the brownstone. They had absolutely no idea that the buyer they were so desperate to appease was currently sitting in the back of a luxury car, applying a fresh coat of lipstick and preparing to walk through their doors. I was not just bringing the hammer down, I was the hammer itself. And the closing was about to begin. The plush leather of the back seat felt like a throne as my driver navigated the icy downtown streets. We were less than 10 minutes away from the mahogany-paneled law office, where my family was currently sweating through their designer clothes. I was reviewing the digital copy of the commercial lien on my tablet when my phone vibrated in my hand. The caller identification showed the main concierge desk of my high-rise. I answered the call, expecting a routine question about a package delivery. Instead, the voice of Julian, the head concierge, came through the speaker tight with suppressed alarm. "Miss Kendra." "I apologize for the urgent interruption," Julian said, keeping his tone remarkably steady. "We have a situation in the main lobby. Two agents from Child Protective Services are here accompanied by a uniformed Chicago police officer. They are demanding immediate access to your residence to conduct an emergency welfare check on your daughter. They claim they received a priority anonymous tip this morning." My blood turned to absolute ice. The ambient heat of the luxury car suddenly felt suffocating. I tapped the glass partition dividing the cabin and locked eyes with my driver through the rearview mirror. "Turn the car around," I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Take us back to the building right now." I ended the call and stared out the tinted window at the freezing city. The sheer magnitude of Brenda's desperation hit me like a physical blow. Connor's empty threats had failed. Chloe's pathetic bargaining had failed. They were backed into a corner with the closing clock ticking down to their financial execution. Realizing they had absolutely no legal leverage to force me to lift the $500,000 encumbrance, my mother had resorted to the ultimate dirty play. She had weaponized the state against her own daughter. In the African American community, calling Child Protective Services on a mother with malicious intent is not just a petty, vindictive tactic. It is a profound existential threat. It is an attempt to use a historically biased system to rip a child away from their home. Brenda knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the terror that a visit from state agents instills in a black mother. She wanted me panicked, rushing to a police station, begging for my daughter. She wanted me so terrified of losing Zuri that I would sign away my commercial lien just to make the investigation disappear. She was willing to traumatize her own 9-year-old granddaughter and put her into the foster care system simply to secure funding for Chloe's imaginary lifestyle brand. That was the exact moment any remaining shred of familial obligation I held for that woman completely evaporated. She was no longer my mother. She was a liability that needed to be permanently eradicated from my life. The drive back to the Gold Coast took 7 minutes. My driver pulled aggressively into the heated underground roundabout. I stepped out of the vehicle, the emerald green designer dress moving fluidly around my legs, and walked directly into the grand lobby. Julian was standing near the marble reception desk, trying to discreetly manage the 3 uninvited guests. 2 social workers, a man holding a thick clipboard, and a woman clutching a tablet stood beside a Chicago police officer, whose hand rested casually on his utility belt. They looked braced for a hostile confrontation, preparing to deal with the unstable homeless woman described in their emergency dispatch. I did not break my stride. I walked straight up to the group, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my stilettos commanding their absolute attention. "I am Kendra," I said, projecting my voice with calm, unwavering authority. "I understand you are here to see my daughter Zuri. I appreciate your commitment to child welfare. Please follow me to the private elevators. We can conduct this investigation in my home." The 3 officials exchanged confused glances. They looked at my flawless hair, my expensive tailored coat, and the effortless way I commanded the opulent lobby. This was clearly not the scenario they had been prepped for, but they followed me in silence. I swiped my secure access card, and we stepped into the velvet-lined elevator car. I pressed the button for the top floor. "You must understand, ma'am." The female caseworker started, her voice faltering slightly as the elevator shot upward in total silence. "We received a priority 1 anonymous tip this morning. The caller was highly distressed. They reported a black woman and a 9-year-old girl who had been violently evicted from a property on the south side. The caller stated you were both currently living out of a freezing vehicle parked in an alleyway. They claimed you were financially destitute, suffering from a severe mental health crisis, and completely neglecting the child's basic survival needs." I kept my eyes fixed on the changing floor numbers above the door. I did not get defensive. I did not raise my voice to argue. When you know you hold all the cards, you do not need to shout. I take these matters extremely seriously, I replied, my tone perfectly even. You have a vital job to do, and I intend to provide you with complete transparency. You will see exactly how my daughter is living. The elevator chimed and the heavy metal doors parted, opening directly into the grand foyer of the penthouse. I stepped aside, allowing the agents and the police officer to walk in before me. I watched the psychological whiplash hit them in real time. They crossed the threshold, preparing to enter a chaotic, dangerous environment. Instead, they stepped onto imported, polished hardwood floors. The air was perfectly climate-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and fresh espresso. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire open-concept living space, showcasing a breathtaking panoramic view of the frozen lake and the glittering downtown skyline. The male caseworker stopped dead in his tracks, lowering his clipboard. He looked at the massive gourmet kitchen, the custom original artwork hanging on the pristine walls, and the plush modern furniture that cost more than his annual salary. "Mommy, is that you?" Zuri's bright, cheerful voice echoed from the kitchen. My 9-year-old daughter rounded the corner of the massive quartz island. She was wearing a thick, cozy matching pajama set and fluffy slippers. She held a crystal bowl filled with fresh strawberries and sliced mango that my overnight nanny had prepared for her. Zuri looked at the three strangers in uniform standing in our foyer. She did not look frightened, she just looked curious. "Good morning, baby," I said, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. "These people are here to do a quick safety check. It is just a routine visit. Are you enjoying your breakfast?" "Yes, Mommy," Zuri smiled brightly, popping a strawberry into her mouth. "Sarah is helping me set up my science project in the guest room. Can we still order pizza tonight?" "Absolutely," I promised. "Go finish your project. I will be right there." Zuri nodded happily and skipped back down the wide hallway, her fluffy slippers padding softly against the expensive rugs. I turned back to the three state officials standing in my foyer. The police officer let out a long, heavy exhale, removing his uniform cap and running a hand through his hair. He clearly realized he had been dragged away from actual police work to participate in a malicious family vendetta. The female caseworker looked absolutely mortified, her cheeks flushing red as she stared at the bowl of fresh fruit sitting on the custom kitchen island. "As you can plainly see," I said, crossing my arms and looking directly at the male caseworker, who was still gripping his clipboard, "I am not living in a freezing vehicle. We are currently standing in a penthouse that I own free and clear. My daughter is fully fed, perfectly safe, and currently working on a school project with her certified private caregiver. I am a highly successful commercial real estate investor. The woman who called you this morning to file that horrific fabricated report is my own mother, Brenda." The caseworker stared at me, completely speechless. "She is currently attempting to force through a fraudulent multi-million-dollar real estate transaction on a property that I hold a $500,000 commercial lien against." I continued, laying out the motive with surgical precision. "When she realized I had the legal power to block her cash sale, she filed this false report to punish me. She wanted to use your agency to terrorize my child and force me into financial submission." The female agent stepped forward, her posture entirely apologetic now. She looked around the immaculate, luxurious space one more time before meeting my eyes. "Ma'am, I am profoundly sorry to have intruded on your home like this," she said, her voice thick with genuine regret. "We are required by law to physically investigate every priority claim we receive, but it is abundantly clear that this report was made with malicious intent. Your daughter is perfectly safe, and this environment is exceptional. We will be closing this case immediately as completely unfounded." "I appreciate your promptness in arriving at that conclusion," I replied, keeping my posture rigid and unyielding. "But simply closing the case is not going to suffice. Filing a false report with Child Protective Services to harass a parent is a crime. I intend to pursue this to the absolute fullest extent of the law. I require the unredacted intake report immediately." I walked back into the kitchen where Zuri was carefully placing a bright yellow foam sun into the center of her diorama. She did not even look up as I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water. The presence of police officers and social workers in our foyer had not registered as a threat to her because she was completely insulated by the undeniable security I had built around us. That was the fundamental difference between the childhood Brenda had provided me and the childhood I was providing for my daughter. I grew up constantly anxious, waiting for the next financial disaster or the next emotional outburst. Zuri was growing up in an environment where her biggest concern was getting the paint to dry evenly on her science project. My phone vibrated against the quartz countertop. It was a secure email from Harrison. True to his word, my general counsel had not just settled for a verbal confirmation of the phone number. He had immediately leveraged his formidable legal network to compel the Department of Family and Support Services to release the official unredacted intake transcript. I opened the encrypted file and read the words my mother had spoken to the emergency dispatcher. The transcript captured every malicious detail. Brenda had utilized a fake name, but her registered cell phone number was stamped clearly at the top of the official state document. She had vividly described me as a deeply disturbed, hostile woman who had violently dragged a screaming child out of a warm home and into a freezing alleyway. She had begged the dispatcher to send police quickly, claiming she feared for her granddaughter's life. Reading the clinical black and white text of her fabricated emergency did not make me cry. It simply extinguished the very last ember of daughterly obligation I possessed. Brenda was willing to send armed police officers to confront a black mother and child in the dead of winter simply because she wanted to secure funding for Chloe's imaginary candle business. She was willing to risk Zuri entering the foster care system just to maintain her own social standing and stroke Connor's inflated ego. The gloves were not just off, the entire arena had been demolished. I forwarded the unredacted state report to a secure folder and dialed Harrison directly. He answered on the first ring, his tone completely strictly business. "We have the intake report," I said, keeping my voice low so Zuri would not overhear the legal strategy. "Brenda's phone number is cemented on a sworn government document. She committed a felony class offense by initiating a false child abuse report. We are going to hold this specific piece of evidence in reserve until the absolute perfect moment." "Understood," Kendra Harrison replied, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing in the background. "I have also finalized the strategy for tomorrow morning. The buyer's attorney, who is representing your anonymous corporate entity, is fully prepped and ready for the 10:00 closing. Connor and your family have absolutely no idea who they are actually dealing with. Give me the exact breakdown of their current legal exposure." I requested walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows to watch the snow swirl around the downtown skyscrapers. "It is a total bloodbath," Harrison said with a dark professional chuckle. "Because Connor listed the property and accepted your all-cash offer while failing to disclose the $500,000 commercial lien, they are currently in material breach of contract. Your corporate entity deposited a massive earnest money sum to secure the aggressive closing timeline. When they fail to deliver a clean title tomorrow morning, your entity has the absolute right to demand specific performance or pursue severe financial damages for the fraudulent misrepresentation. Connor's brokerage will drop him instantly to avoid liability. He will be personally sued for the broken contract, and the State Real Estate Commission will launch an immediate investigation into his licensing based on fraudulent disclosure. And the property itself, I asked, watching a plane cut through the dark winter sky. Because they are in default on the original loan you issued through Apex Holdings. We are initiating the foreclosure process on the brownstone tomorrow, Harrison confirmed. Brenda will be legally evicted. The house will revert entirely to your portfolio. They are walking into that law office tomorrow, expecting to walk out with $2 million in cash. Instead, they are going to walk out with crippling legal debt, a destroyed career, and absolutely nowhere to live. "Perfect," I said, my voice a sharp blade of absolute certainty. "Make sure the buyer's attorney sets the trap exactly as we discussed. I want them sitting at that conference table, sweating through their clothes before the hammer drops." I ended the call and spent the rest of the evening focused entirely on Zuri. We ordered a massive gourmet pizza from a famous local Italian spot and ate it right out of the box while watching animated movies on the 80-inch television. I brushed her hair, tucked her into the plush hotel-quality bedding, and read her a story until she fell fast asleep. Looking at her peaceful, resting face, I felt a profound surge of protective power. I had built an empire to ensure she would never feel the cold sting of poverty or the bitter pain of family betrayal. The night stretched on, but I did not sleep. I sat in the dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of the Chicago skyline. I imagined the scene playing out just a few miles away in whatever cramped space Connor and Chloe were currently occupying. I pictured Connor pacing the floor, clutching a glass of cheap whiskey, frantically reviewing real estate laws he barely comprehended, trying to find a loophole that simply did not exist. I pictured Chloe crying over her ruined brand launch, blaming everyone but herself for the catastrophic failure of her entitlement. I pictured Brenda lying awake staring at the ceiling, wondering why her malicious call to Child Protective Services had not resulted in a desperate begging phone call from me. They were trapped in a pressure cooker of their own arrogant design, and the heat was rising by the second. Friday morning dawned with a blinding, brilliant sunshine that bounced harshly off the ice-covered city streets. The winter storm had passed, leaving a frigid, beautiful landscape in its wake. I woke up feeling completely energized. Today was the day of the closing. Today was the day the illusion of their superiority would be permanently shattered. I took my time getting ready, treating the morning routine like putting on armor for a highly anticipated battle. I bypassed my standard unassuming appraisal suits and went straight for a custom-tailored stark white wool suit that commanded absolute authority. I paired it with a silk emerald blouse, sharp black stilettos, and minimal but expensive gold jewelry. I looked like a woman who owned the building, not a woman who was begging for a seat at the table. The overnight nanny arrived right on time to take over for the day, and I kissed Zuri goodbye, promising her a special dinner to celebrate the weekend. I grabbed my sleek black leather portfolio, ensuring the original promissory note, the recorded lien, and the unredacted Child Protective Services report were all perfectly organized inside. My private driver was waiting for me in the heated underground garage. As I slid into the back of the luxury sedan, I gave him the address of the plush mahogany-paneled law office, located in the heart of the financial district. The drive through the city was smooth, the morning traffic parting around my vehicle. I watched the towering corporate buildings pass by, feeling a profound sense of ownership over my reality. My family was currently sitting in a downtown conference room, sweating through their designer clothes, staring at the clock, and praying for a miracle. They were hoping they could somehow force the sale through beg the anonymous buyer for a massive extension or negotiate their way out of the fraud they had committed. They were terrified of the faceless corporate entity that had aggressively outbid the market to secure the brownstone. They had absolutely no idea that the buyer they were so desperate to appease was currently pulling up to the curb, stepping out into the freezing Chicago air, and preparing to walk through their doors to deliver their absolute financial execution. The atmosphere inside the mahogany-paneled conference room of Harrison Corporate Law Firm was thick enough to choke on. I sat comfortably in Harrison Private Executive Suite just down the hall, watching the live closed-circuit video feed on a massive flat-screen monitor. It had been exactly 3 days since I found Zuri shivering in the snow, 3 days since Brenda sent that text. Now the clock on the conference room wall ticked relentlessly toward 10 in the morning. Connor was visibly sweating. He kept loosening his silk tie and wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He paced the length of the room, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly against the polished floors. Chloe sat frozen at the massive granite table, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a flotation device. She was frantically chewing on her thumbnail, the arrogant wellness brand entrepreneur completely reduced to a terrified spectator. Brenda sat next to her, staring blankly at the complimentary bottles of sparkling water. The illusion of her matriarchal superiority had completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, panicked woman who realized she was about to lose everything. They were hoping for a miracle. I could see it in the way Connor kept checking his gold watch. They had walked into this high-rise expecting to sit across from an anonymous cash buyer. They were praying they could somehow force the sale through, beg for a massive extension on the closing, or negotiate a way to bury the $500,000 commercial lien I held against the property. They needed the capital to cover their tracks and save Connor real estate license from total destruction. They were desperate. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. Harrison walked in wearing a pristine charcoal suit, He carried a single manila folder and a sleek black conference phone. He did not smile. He did not offer a warm corporate greeting. He radiated the kind of ruthless legal authority that makes amateurs like Connor instantly shrink in their seats. Connor immediately leaped forward, extending his hand with a forced, desperate grin. "Good morning," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I am Connor, the listing agent. This is the seller, Brenda. We have a slight administrative hurdle with the title commitment this morning, but I am highly confident we can work out an addendum with your client. We are prepared to offer seller concessions to push this closing through today." Harrison ignored the outstretched hand. He walked to the center of the granite table and set the manila folder down. He placed the black conference phone right next to it. "My client has no interest in seller concessions," Harrison stated, his voice a flat, clinical blade. "Furthermore, my client prefers to handle the specifics of this breach of contract directly." Harrison tapped a button on the console. A sharp beep echoed through the room. Down the hall in the executive suite, I leaned forward toward the microphone on my desk. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute power of the moment settle in my chest. "Good morning, Connor," I said, my voice projecting crystal clear through the speakerphone. "Good morning, Chloe. Good morning, Mother." The physical reaction in the conference room was instantaneous and absolute. Connor stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a leather chair. Chloe gasped, dropping her handbag to the floor. Brenda shot up from her seat, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it practically radiated through the video feed. They stared at the black phone in the center of the table as if it were a live explosive. Kendra, Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "What are you doing on this phone? Where is the buyer?" I smiled even though they could not see me. "I am the buyer, Brenda," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured and utterly lethal. "I am the sole proprietor of the corporate entity that submitted the all-cash offer on the brownstone. I am the anonymous investor you have been desperately trying to appease." The absolute horror washed over their faces as the reality of the trap snapped shut around them. "You see, Connor?" I continued, leaning back in my chair. "I knew you were too arrogant and too incompetent to properly vet a corporate purchasing entity. You saw a massive cash offer well above market value, and your greed completely blinded you. You rushed the contract. You signed the seller disclosure forms guaranteeing a clean and unencumbered title. You legally certified that the property was free of any liens." "That is entrapment!" Connor shouted, his voice pitching upward in panic. "You set us up. You knew about the commercial lien because you hold the lien. This is illegal." Harrison stepped forward, leaning his knuckles against the granite table. "Actually, Connor, it is perfectly legal. My client utilized a standard blind trust for a commercial acquisition. It is not my client's responsibility to do your job for you. You are the licensed real estate broker representing the seller. You failed to conduct basic due diligence. You failed to pull a comprehensive title report. You signed a legally binding contract falsely claiming the property was clear. That is not entrapment. That is fraudulent misrepresentation, and you committed it in writing." Connor collapsed into the leather chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew his career was entirely finished. "Because you failed to disclose the $500,000 encumbrance to my corporate entity," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence in the room. "You are now in material breach of contract. My entity deposited a massive earnest money sum to secure this closing. Because you cannot deliver a clean title today, the sale is officially dead. However, the financial penalties outlined in the contract for your fraudulent breach are very much alive. You do not get a single cent from this sale, but you are now legally liable to my corporation for extensive financial damages." The conference room instantly erupted into absolute chaos. Chloe spun around and slammed her hands against Connor's shoulders. "You idiot!" Chloe screamed, her carefully constructed image completely shattering. "You told me you checked everything. You told me my brand funding was secure. You completely ruined my life. I am tied to your fraud now." Connor shot out of his chair, pointing a trembling finger at the speakerphone. "I am suing you, Kendra. I will tie you up in court for the next 10 years. I will tell the state licensing board everything. You are a manipulative sociopath." Sue me with what, Connor? I asked, laughing softly into the microphone. You are about to be blacklisted by your own brokerage. The State Real Estate Commission will receive the fraud documentation by noon today. You are going to be drowning in legal fees just trying to keep yourself out of a prison cell. Brenda fell back into her chair and started sobbing heavily. The tears were real this time, but they were tears of self-pity. She realized that her golden child was financially ruined, her prized son-in-law was a fraud, and the daughter she had treated like garbage held the keys to her entire existence. She leaned toward the center of the table, her voice cracking as she resorted to her ultimate manipulation tactic. Kendra, please, Brenda wailed, gripping the edge of the granite. You cannot do this to us. We are blood. I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot destroy your own family over money. Please, baby, just drop the penalties. Just release the lien so we can walk away. I am begging you. I stared at the video feed, watching the woman who had tormented me my entire life crying over a speakerphone. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse. I thought about the college fund she stole. I thought about the malicious call she made to Child Protective Services, hoping to have Zuri dragged away by the state. And I thought about my 9-year-old daughter shivering in the snow, staring at a locked door. You made your choice about family 3 days ago, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, unyielding whisper. When you locked my child outside in the snow, you ceased to be my mother. You ceased to be family. You became a liability, and I deal with liabilities decisively. I paused, letting the weight of my words press down on them. I am executing the commercial lien today, I announced. Because the loan is in default, Apex Holdings is foreclosing on the brownstone. The eviction notices will be served by the sheriff department this afternoon. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before you are physically removed from the property. Brenda let out a guttural scream of absolute despair. But where am I supposed to go? She sobbed, her hands flying to her face. I have no money. I have no savings. You are putting me on the street. I have nowhere to go. I leaned close to the microphone, delivering the exact words she had texted me while I was driving through the blizzard to rescue my freezing child. You are homeless now, I said, perfectly matching her cold, arrogant tone from 3 days ago. Figure it out. I reached out and disconnected the line. The feed on the monitor showed the 3 of them sitting in the wreckage of their own arrogant greed, screaming and fighting among themselves. I turned off the screen, grabbed my coat, and walked out of the executive suite to head back to my penthouse. I tapped the red button on my screen, ending the call, and placed my phone face down on the leather seat of my vehicle. That single fluid motion did not just sever a phone connection. It triggered an absolute avalanche that would systematically bury the 3 people sitting in that downtown conference room. When you pull the pin on a grenade, you do not stick around to watch the explosion. You simply walk away and let the shockwave do the work. By Monday morning, the legal machinery Harrison and I had meticulously positioned sprang into lethal action. The buyer's attorney representing my corporate entity filed a massive civil lawsuit for breach of contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, and damages against Connor. But the financial ruin was only the first domino to fall. Harrison officially submitted the recorded voicemails and the forged disclosure documents to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. They did not hesitate. Connor's real estate broker license was suspended immediately pending a full state investigation into his fraudulent practices. His brokerage, the firm that gave him the arrogant platform he used to belittle me, reacted with ruthless corporate self-preservation. They fired him before noon on Tuesday. They did not just terminate his employment. They completely scrubbed his name, his photos, and his active listings from their website. He was escorted out of his office by security carrying a single cardboard box. Connor had strutted around family dinners, boasting about his shrewd navigation of the urban market and his untouchable network. In reality, he was just a mediocre man who had arrogantly walked blindfolded into a federal-level legal trap. Stripped of his license and facing millions in liability, his fragile ego completely shattered. The suffocating pressure of absolute financial ruin acted like a blowtorch on his marriage to my sister. Without the stolen equity from the brownstone to fund her lifestyle brand, Chloe's imaginary wellness empire evaporated into thin air. She had built her entire adult personality around being the pampered wife of a successful real estate investor. When the money vanished, the affection vanished with it. The walls of their expensive leased condo became an echo chamber for their mutual destruction. Chloe demanded that Connor fix the situation, screaming that he was supposed to be the business genius who took care of her. Connor fired back with vicious venom, blaming Chloe and Brenda for setting him up by hiding the commercial lien. The golden child and the white savior turned on each other like starved wolves in a cage. Within 3 weeks, the screaming matches escalated to filing fees. Chloe filed for a swift and bitter divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and attempting to position herself as a victim of his professional negligence. Connor immediately countersued, trying to legally tether her to the massive breach of contract debt. They were entirely consumed by the vicious dissolution of their picture-perfect union. Stripped of her mother's financial bailouts and drowning in legal fees, Chloe was forced to vacate their luxury rental. The woman who had sneered at my career from behind a crystal champagne flute had to secure a basic entry-level job working the cosmetics counter at a mid-tier suburban mall just to keep her phone from being disconnected. But the most spectacular and satisfying downfall belonged entirely to Brenda. My mother assumed she could simply spin this disaster the way she spun everything else. She thought she could put on a tailored Sunday suit, march into her church, and cry at the altar about how her rebellious, ruthless daughter had unfairly evicted her. She intended to play the martyr, banking on the congregation to rally around her and offer financial support. But the community was small, and the truth always travels faster than a Sunday sermon. Harrison officially filed the police report regarding her malicious call to the Department of Family and Support Services. It instantly became a matter of public record. It did not take long for the details to circulate through the tight-knit church community. The congregation discovered that Brenda had deliberately weaponized the state child welfare system against a black mother and a 9-year-old child. She had tried to send armed police officers to rip her own granddaughter away simply to secure cash for a vanity project. In our community, crossing that specific line is the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. You do not call the system on your own blood. The social execution was swift and absolute. The same church aunties who had praised her manipulative Facebook post just days earlier immediately cut her off. Her coveted position on the usher board was revoked without discussion. The pastor stopped returning her calls completely, freezing her out of the inner circle she had spent decades social climbing to reach. Brenda was entirely stripped of her church status. She lost her audience, her defenders, and her carefully constructed matriarchal facade. The absolute social isolation broke her spirit far faster than the financial loss ever could. The foreclosure process on the brownstone was executed with clinical precision. With the commercial loan in default, Brenda was legally evicted from the premises. Because she had squandered my father's life insurance and possessed absolutely no savings, she had zero safety net. Chloe was completely broke from the divorce, and Connor was facing potential jail time. Nobody was coming to rescue her. The woman who had looked down her nose at my modest beginnings was forced to pack her designer clothes into heavy-duty garbage bags. She had to move into a tiny, cramped, low-income apartment on the far outskirts of the city. There were no original hardwood floors or custom crown moldings. Her new reality consisted of peeling linoleum, drafty windows, and the constant hum of the nearby expressway. She spent her days sitting in a tiny, dimly lit living room, completely alone, staring at the bare walls. Her phone never rang. Her social circle had completely abandoned her once the horrifying truth of the Child Protective Services call and the real estate fraud came to light. Brenda had built her entire identity on controlling others and projecting an image of flawless superiority. When she tried to destroy me, she inadvertently demolished the very pillars of her own existence, leaving herself trapped in a prison constructed entirely of her own arrogant greed. I stood on the sidewalk outside the South Side brownstone, holding a brand new set of heavy brass keys. The arrogant sold sign that Connor had aggressively pounded into the front lawn was completely gone, removed by my contractors weeks ago. The thick winter snow had finally melted, leaving the ground clear and ready for a fresh start. I pushed the heavy oak front doors open and stepped inside. The house was entirely empty. The expensive antique furniture Brenda had meticulously curated to impress her church friends had been liquidated to pay her mounting legal fees. Walking through the silent rooms, I felt absolutely no sentimental attachment. Every corner of this property held the echo of a toxic expectation. I looked at the formal dining room, where I was constantly compared to Chloe. I walked past the grand staircase, where Brenda used to lecture me on my inadequacies, telling me I needed to work twice as hard just to be considered acceptable. This building was a monument to generational trauma. I had absolutely no intention of moving my daughter into a space built on a foundation of conditional love and manipulation. But in the world of commercial real estate, we know that a structurally sound building can always be repurposed. It just needs a visionary to tear out the rot and rebuild the interior. I established a new nonprofit entity entirely separate from my corporate holdings. I brought in a team of elite architects and contractors, and we gutted the interior down to the very studs. We ripped out the dark, heavy paneling and the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere. In its place, we built something full of brilliant light and absolute purpose. Within 6 months, the property was officially reborn as a fully subsidized community center dedicated exclusively to young at-risk African American girls in Chicago. I wanted to build the exact kind of safe haven I desperately needed when I was a young girl trying to navigate the weight of the world alone. We created a true sanctuary. The main floor became a collaborative workspace with state-of-the-art computers, coding stations, and financial literacy classrooms. The upper levels were transformed into mentorship suites, counseling offices, and creative art studios. I staffed the building with brilliant Black female professionals who were dedicated to empowering the next generation. The centerpiece of the entire renovation was the front parlor. It was the exact room with the large bay windows that overlooked the wrought iron gate where my daughter had been left freezing in the snow. I had the walls lined with custom mahogany bookshelves and filled them with thousands of volumes featuring brilliant, capable Black female protagonists. We installed plush velvet window seats, warm ambient lighting, and thick woven rugs. A polished bronze plaque was mounted directly outside the heavy glass double doors. It read, "The Zuri Reading Room." When I brought my daughter to the grand opening and showed her the gleaming plaque, she hugged me so tightly, I thought my ribs might crack. She watched dozens of young girls running through the bright halls laughing and learning, completely safe and entirely welcome. The trauma of that freezing winter day was permanently overwritten by the profound joy of giving back to our community. The gate that was once a symbol of her exclusion was now propped wide open, inviting the neighborhood inside. Later that evening, we returned to our actual home. The harsh Chicago winter was finally giving way to a gentle spring, but the night air outside the penthouse windows was still crisp and biting. Inside, the climate control maintained a perfect 72 degrees. I stood in the massive gourmet kitchen, frothing whole milk and stirring rich dark chocolate into 2 heavy ceramic mugs. The smell of cocoa and vanilla filled the warm air. I carried the steaming mugs into the expansive living room where Zuri was curled up in her favorite velvet armchair, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I handed her a mug and sat in the matching chair beside her. We looked out over the glittering grid of the city. The towering skyscrapers, the winding river, and the endless stream of headlights cutting through the dark created a masterpiece of urban light. I thought about the woman shivering in her cramped, low-income apartment on the desolate outskirts of the city, wondering how she had lost her entire empire in the blink of an eye. Brenda had traded her daughter and her granddaughter for a fleeting illusion of superiority and a desperate grab at social status. She had played a ruthless game and lost everything. I had traded her for absolute peace. I took a slow sip of the hot cocoa, the rich warmth spreading through my chest and settling deep into my bones. The generational curse that had suffocated the women in my family for decades stopped right here at the top floor of this high-rise. Zuri would never know the cold sting of a mother's betrayal. She would never be forced to earn her right to exist in her own home or beg for scraps of conditional affection. She would only know security, unconditional love, and the unshakable power of her own absolute worth. We were entirely safe. We were untouchable. We were finally and completely free. The most profound lesson from this story is that true strength is forged in silence and unyielding boundaries. You cannot control the family you are born into, nor can you prevent their toxic expectations or betrayals. However, you retain absolute power over your reaction. When faced with deliberate cruelty, you do not need to scream, perform, or beg for validation from people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, channel that energy into building your own independence and peace. Generational trauma stops when you decide your worth is no longer up for negotiation. Sometimes the ultimate victory is simply thriving elsewhere. Share your own journey of setting healthy boundaries in the comments below, and hit subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience and triumph.